Tonight's presentation is going to be given by Patsy Cotterill, who's a director with the Edmonton Native Plant Society. My name is Kate Spencer, and I'm currently the president of the society. Tonight's presentation is called Gibbons Badlands Prairie, a Special Place, and it'll take about 1 hour. And if you could please put any questions in the chat, we'll go through them at the end of the presentation. And yeah, and we are recording it just for folks who weren't able to make it tonight. So yeah, if you want to share your screen, Patsy, we'll get started. Thanks.
Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. It's a little bit of a long time since I've done a presentation, so I'm hoping it's going to go okay. Right. First of all, we will go back. Yeah, so tonight we're going to take a look at a rather special area that has some badlands features, and it's also very interesting botanically. It's a stretch of embankment of the Sturgeon River, about an hour north of Edmonton, along Highway 28, and opposite the town of Gibbons. Now, the Edmonton Native Plant Society have been aware of this since about 2011, when someone from the Alberta Cactus and Succulent Society drew our attention to the fact that brittle prickly pear cactus grew there. And we've named the area Gibbons Badlands Prairie, and we've been visiting it ever since. In that time, we've recorded 165 species of vascular plants, and including among them 30 grasses, which is pretty amazing, all of which are native species, all of which 4 are native species. So this is what the stretch of a river escarpment looks like. On the left, we're looking northwards. The Sturgeon River is snaking through that culvert, over the top of which Highway 28 is passing. And you can see it's large, an expanse of grassland slopes with some areas of shrubbery in the middle of it. And to the right, this is the south view. Looking again along the same escarpment, you can see something of a small trail on the side, sort of traversing the slope about the middle of the slope. And you can see there's a fair amount of white spruce also present in the valley of the Sturgeon River. Tonight we'll take a look at the location of this Gibbons Badlands Prairie, as we call it. It's an informal name. Look at the landforms and the plant communities that are on them. We'll look at a few of the plants of these grassland slopes and their adaptations to their habitats. And then towards the end, I'm just going to look at some of the threats that are facing the prairie. What ENPS has done so far in terms of looking at attempting to protect the site, and what possible future options there may be for protection. The map on the right is a Google map, and this is the stretch of escarpment of interest that I'm talking about. This is the Sturgeon River, snaking along, passing under Highway 28 here. You can see some sort of pale greenish areas. These are the grassland slopes. There are also some areas of ravines and gullies with a denser vegetation of shrubs and some trees. And these white areas are actually the badland outcrops. These are white bentonitic clay slopes. These are the true badland features. Here we can see that this is the same area. It's about 24.7 hectares, of which 17.5 hectares are owned by the town of Gibbons. And this portion here, which corresponds to this area up here, is actually Crown land. And I presume it was appropriated when the Highway 28 was built to join with Highway 28 moving northwards here. These are the different landforms that we see on this stretch of escarpment. Top left is an eroded gully. We're looking at some of the sediments that form this escarpment. This looks like a sandy bottom here with some red sort of sandstone sediment pieces. This darker portion is probably an organic layer. On the more gentler slopes, we do have consolidated grassland. This is Highway 28 at the top here with a fringe of aspen forest. We have a shrubby vegetation at the moister bottomland slopes where water accumulates, and also along the river we have again riparian vegetation with lots of shrubs. This is a closer look at the badland features. These look rather similar to the kind of thing that you see when you're in Drumheller in the badlands of the Red Deer River. You can see these fairly steep slopes with bentonitic clay, some evidence of layering with these stratifications here. Again, those broken sediments of either sandstone or ironstone. And something similar on this side, a bit of a closer up, showing the erosional channels with water, where water has flown down and incised the slopes. The term badlands, as you probably already know, comes from the French, a direct translation of the French, les mauvaises terres à traverser, meaning the badlands, bad lands to cross. And it was the term coined by French fur traders who, in exploring North America, found these lands very difficult to cross. And if anyone actually has been on these kind of bentonitic slopes during a rainstorm, will know that it's almost impossible to stand upright on them. They are so very slippery. Again, a badland scene, much erosion because the steep is so very slow, but some vegetation can gain a hold on the slight narrow terraces between the slopes. On the right, this crumbly formation is known as popcorn, and it's indicative of bentonitic clay. And it's also the sort of thing that you would see somewhere like Dinosaur Provincial Park. Here's the well-eroded gully again. On the right, we have actually found these fossil cones, coniferous, dating back to about 75 million years ago at the time of the dinosaurs, a time when coniferous trees were rather more a predominant member of the flora than they are today. I should point out that it's no coincidence that badlands are found on the banks of rivers, of course. At the end of the last ice age, there would be huge rivers flowing with glacial meltwater flowing down from the Rocky Mountains and cutting down through layers of sediment on the landscape. This landscape would have been built up some 75 million years ago from rivers flowing at that time and depositing sediment into a central inland sea. And of course, animals and plants would be living along these rivers, and they would be killed and overcome, or they would be buried by these sediments, and they would form fossils, which of course is the reason why the Red Deer River is such a wonderful source of dinosaur footprints. A look at some of the Badlands flora. Let me just see if I can move my thing here. Well, this is western wheatgrass, Elymus Pascoparum smithii, western wheatgrass. It's a pale green grass which forms these extensive patches because it's rhizomatous, and is able to stabilize these eroding badland slopes. Like many a grass, it has fairly narrow leaves which are at right angles, are perpendicular to the sun's rays, so they don't receive a lot of insolation, which means they don't lose a lot of heat. They also have very narrow spikes, flowering spikes here. These are the stamens hanging off, very narrow florets within the spikelets and narrow glooms, all of which reduces loss from exposure to hot air. And the plant is extremely cold tolerant, one of its adaptative features. And it has a C3 photosynthesis. Now, this isn't a particular adaptation. Many plants have photosynthesis. It's the main type. But I'm mentioning now to contrast it with some other plants in the prairie that do have a different type of photosynthesis, and I will explain this a little more later on. So that was western wheatgrass. Now we have another wheatgrass. This is thick spike wheatgrass, and it has similar adaptations. It's rhizomatous, so it forms patches. It has somewhat narrow, somewhat broader glooms than the western wheatgrass. It's also very drought tolerant, and also can be grey-green. So the two species are rather difficult to tell apart. It too has C3 photosynthesis, so nothing too remarkable about that, given its habitat. And incidentally, C3 photosynthesis is so called because in the chloroplast of the green cell, one molecule of carbon dioxide from carbon dioxide combines with a 5-carbon compound, which then splits into 2 3-carbon molecules before the 6-carbon sugar is formed. Because of those 2 3-carbon molecules that are the first products of the photosynthetic cycle, it is called C3 photosynthesis. This is a very typical plant of Badlands, gardener's saltbush, Atriplex gardneri. It comes in 2 genders, which should please Donald Trump. The male plant to the left, you can see the little small, little tiny stamens peeking out. It is a member of the Amaranthaceae, which includes the chenopods and the amaranths, and all those families have these very tiny, numerous flowers. The female with the pink stigmas is on the right. And what's most remarkable about this plant is that it has these very thick gray-green leaves, which are scurfy, and do sort of also repel the sunlight. But they also have a particular type of leaf anatomy called crantz venation. And this is used in to carry out C4 synthesis. This is Gardner's saltbush, the whole plant on the left. You can see it likes fairly bare badland habitats and soils. On the right is a cross-section of the leaves that it has, these leaves with a crantz leaf anatomy. And what's remarkable about them is not that they have these mesophyll cells on the top layer or these spongy mesophyll layers on the bottom, but they have this ring of very tight shell cells surrounding the veins, called the bundle sheath cells. And what happens in C4 photosynthesis is carbon dioxide comes in through the stoma, is converted, first of all, into malic acid, a 4-carbon molecule, by joining with a 3-carbon molecule to form malic acid, which is then shunted into this ring of bundle cells where the normal C3 cycle takes place. And C4 always includes 2 steps, the 4-carbon formation of a molecule, and then a movement into within the chloroplast into the 3-carbon cycle, or C3, a 2-step process. This type of C4 photosynthesis takes place in this kind of leaf with crantz anatomy. Blue grama grass is abundant at the prairie, Bouteloua gracilis, a very popular grass because of its distinctive horizontal panicles, which look like eyelashes. These are the little stamens hanging down from the horizontal spikes. It's both tufted and rhizomatous and stabilizes soils. And when it dies down in the late summer, and it's very much more abundant in southern Alberta, it dries up and it becomes a matted mass called prairie wool. Now, this is a grass that, unlike the wheat grasses we've seen, undergoes C4 photosynthesis. Here's another picture of it. I couldn't resist throwing. This is Manna's lovely picture of a patch of blue grama on a slope, and in the background is a backdrop of white spruce in one of the ravines. This is what crantz leaf anatomy looks like in the cylindrical rolled up leaf of a grass. These are these bundle leaf cells. Why I keep saying shells, I don't know. Bundle leaf cells, surrounded by mesophyll cells where the initial formation of malic acid in the C4 step it takes place and is then shunted back into the layer of bundle sheath cells. Here they are again, look in this cross section here. So this C4 photosynthesis is an important physiological adaptation to habitats where the climate is hot and therefore very often dry. And I hope we'll have time at the end for me to explain a little more of why it is so adaptive. Okay, so this is the iconic plant of Gibbons Prairie. The reason why we were drawn to the initial visits there. It's fragile prickly pear cactus, Opuntia fragilis. And it shows some cacti show obvious adaptations to dry, bare habitats. The stems are flattened, succulent pads, capable of detaching and dispersal. The leaves are so small, they're almost inconspicuous to reduce water loss. They have bristles and spines, which protect against herbivores. They do produce succulent fruits, which entices them to be dispersed by animals, including some humans, of course, in southern parts of the US where cacti fruit are eaten. It has shallow roots that absorb surface water quickly when, say, there is a shower of rain. And it has another type of photosynthesis called CAM photosynthesis. Crassulacean acid photosynthesis. Now, this has the first same step as plants with C4 photosynthesis with the Krantz anatomy. But in this case, there are no special bundle sheath cells. The difference is in CAM photosynthesis, the plant's stomata, the openings by which the carbon dioxide enter, only open at night. So carbon dioxide only enters the plant at night. And it isn't until the daylight that the full C3 photosynthetic process that produces the 6-carbon sugar takes place, because that needs the energy of sunlight in order to enable that C3 process. But because the stomata are closed at night, the plant is not losing water during the heat of the day. And also it means that because there is no oxygen either entering the plant, then the photosynthesis is taking place in a low oxygen atmosphere. And I will endeavor later to explain why it's important that the C3 cycle does not take place in a situation in the cell where there is a lot of oxygen. Another typical species is prairie sagewort, Artemisia frigida. This has these narrow leaves that are gray hairy. These reflect sunlight and again reduce water loss, and it can be seen growing in a badland situation here. This is this species colonizing a badland gully with that popcorn formation on either side. There are a couple of white asters present in the prairie. One is white prairie aster, Symphyotrichum falcatum, and the other is the tufted white prairie aster. The white prairie aster tends to be associated more with badland situations, dry, eroding slopes, and it differs from the tufted, which is much more a general species of grasslands, by having larger, fewer flowers. These are composite flowers, of course. It's a member of the Asteraceae, which are not so much turned to one side as in the tufted white prairie aster. Both species have narrow leaves, usually covered with hairs, with prickly points to the tip of the leaflet. And these are two yellow-flowered members of the Asteraceae. These, of course, are composite heads. Curly cup gumweed is so called because it has a sticky resin on these green cups or involucres that support the flower head. And that resin reduces loss of water by preventing loss of water molecules. The term squaros refers to the fact that the tips of these involucral bracts are turned backwards, downwards. Spiny iron plant is another yellow Asteraceae member. It is a low sprawling plant with finely divided hairy leaves. It's much more commonly encountered down in southern parts of the province, but we're pleased to see that it does seem to be holding its own and actually spreading at Gibbons Prairie on the steeper slopes. Now, this is an interesting plant. We're moving it into the Fabaceae pea flower family now. This is two-grooved milkvetch, Astragalus bisulcatus. It's a fairly prominent tufted perennial with a thick rootstock. You can see in the right-hand picture, it's a member of the Fabaceae. It has typical pea flowers. Some of them are even developing into pods on this lower portion of the cluster. And it has typical Leguminosae or Fabaceae family leaves with pinnate leaves with narrow opposite leaflets. This plant concentrates selenium, and I had an interesting experience with this plant when I lived in Regina. I went out to a little prairie a few miles east of Regina. I wasn't familiar with prairies at the time. I came across this new plant and I thought, oh, I don't know that one. I'll collect it. So I collected it and brought it back and started drying it in my field press. And after about an hour or two, I became aware of this terrible smell in the house, a smell that proceeded to get much, much worse till it was overpowering. And I had to actually throw the plant out. I couldn't stand it any longer. And I'm assuming that what was happening was that as the plant dried, it was concentrating this selenium, and that was what was causing the smell. Selenium, of course, is toxic. You've probably heard about it recently in connection with coal mine development, where the fear is that the mining excavations will release selenium into the groundwater and render it toxic. It's not the only milkvetch in the prairie. There is also loose-flowered milkvetch, Astragalus multiflorus. In the older textbooks, it was known as Astragalus tenellus. It's tufted, it's sprawling. It has these same pinnate leaves, but they're even more, even narrower than they are in the two-grooved. And it has this preference for alkaline or calcareous soils. It does occur very occasionally in the North Saskatchewan River Valley in the Edmonton area. A couple more milkvetches, flexible milkvetch, pink-flowered sprawling herb, gray-green, gray-hairy, also toxic. That's also found on the Badlands slopes in places like Whitemud Ravine and Badlands of the North Saskatchewan River Valley. And field milkvetch, which strictly speaking is just a general grassland species. It likes, I think, somewhat more moister soils. It's rhizomatous and patch forming. And this also can be found sporadically in places within Edmonton. Many milkvetches and also a rather related member of the Fabaceae called the locoweeds, the Oxytropis species, occur in these bare or sparsely vegetated habitats, such as badlands and sandy slopes, and often in alkaline soils. And they're able to compete and thrive in these sort of situations because they fix atmospheric nitrogen in their roots, like all members of the Fabaceae. and that gives them a competitive advantage in soils of low fertility. But many of them are also toxic to livestock because of that ability to concentrate selenium. Another Badlands plant is the scarlet globe mallow, and we always like to find that. Spiralsia coccinea. It's a member of the Malvaceae family, or mallows, and again, it's a lot commoner in southern Alberta than it is around here. The mallow family have these rather strange fruits that look like sort of round cheeses with segments marked in them. It looks as though this plant may be actually developing fruits, but unfortunately we haven't been able to find much in the way of fruits of these families, which would enable us to perhaps grow them or try to germinate them. And the final member of the Badlands flora that I'm going to show is not a vascular plant, but it's a group of organisms called cryptogamic crust. This cryptogamic crust extends a few millimeters down from the top of the soil in dryland ecosystems, and it consists of a web of small organisms such as cyanobacteria, algae, microfungi, mosses, and liverworts. It binds the soil, it allows water to infiltrate, and increases the resistance of the soil to erosion by wind and water. And you can imagine what happens when a OHV, all-terrain vehicle, comes along and digs a deep rut in this wonderful surface that's reducing erosion. It's a shame it doesn't reconstitute very easily. So moving on to the grassland flora, I'm pleased to say that there are good populations of prairie crocus on the somewhat lower slopes of the escarpment. This prairie crocus is not so much a plant, I would say, adapted to saving moisture in dry grasslands as to a phenology that begins in early spring. These big parabolic flowers emerge in usually about April, and you can see it's amidst the winter litter, so before the grass has greened up. Concentrates warmth on the central part of the flower, the stamens and the numerous ovaries. It's also a good place for pollinators to sit and bask in the sun. It has lots of hairy involucral leaves that will help to reduce, again, loss of heat and moisture. And then when the ovules have been pollinated and seeds are starting to develop, then these very short stems elongate enormously, bringing it up to sort of level with the surrounding vegetation, which has since grown up in about May or early June or so. And it starts to disperse its seeds, which have these long awns attached, enabling dispersal by the wind, and these finely divided but much taller leaves. And by about midsummer, the whole plant has finished its cycle and is started to become dormant. It has enough food to enable it to survive the winter and start again the following spring very early on. Three other flowers of the prairie are three-flowered avens, Geum triflorum, with those three nodding pink flowers, a lot of segmented basal leaves, and both of our local arnica species, shining arnica with the smaller leaves, or both species have opposite leaves. All arnicas have opposite leaves. Are smaller with somewhat smaller flower heads in the case of shining arnica, and these larger oval leaves and bigger flower heads with several flowers are in the leafy arnica. All of these plants tend to like a certain amount of moisture, so they do tend to occur the lower parts of the slopes rather than on the steeply sloping areas. We have patches of several patches of needle and threadgrass and northern porcupine grass. Both are members of the genus Hesperostipa. Again, these are much more common down south, but do occur on sandy soils. For example, they also occur at Fort Saskatchewan Prairie. And these, by the way, are C3 grasses, so they don't surprisingly have that C4 adaptation. You can see why they're called needle and thread or porcupine grass. They have these long pointed, narrow seeds, very sharply pointed at the base. So they easily stick into animals and animals' fur and people's clothing. And they have this long twisted awn. And when the seed has penetrated the ground, that awn will twist and untwist and actually drill the seed down into the ground. So some very nice extensive patches of both these species in the prairie. There is a lovely amount of very beautiful June grass, which is strikingly beautiful in June, hence its name, with these silver shining panicles. But following pollination, these same rather broader spikes then close up into these narrow brownish spikes with a somewhat different appearance. We have 3 members of the reedgrass genus in the prairie, the Calamagrostis genus, plains reedgrass on the left, occurring in the fairly dry grasslands, blue joint reedgrass, which is a moisture-loving grass, so that's found in the bottomlands and often in the forests, and in moist parts of prairies generally. And slim-stemmed reedgrass, which tends to like somewhat calcareous areas. There is, for example, quite a bit of it also in the grassy areas of peatlands. I'm pleased to say we do have some plains rough fescue, Festuca hallei, although it isn't very, very abundant at Gibbons. This, of course, is the iconic grass that covered all the plains, both central and southern Alberta, before the plow, but has since really not regenerated to any significant extent at all, so that where it exists, it's always indicative of an unspoiled prairie. But we also have an even rarer grass present, Canada ricegrass, Piptathoropsis canadensis. And I'm sorry to say that I personally did not detect this. It took a rare plant botanist to come along and find 2 populations for us in Gibbons Prairie, which she pointed out to us. And we were able to find the second population from her description of its location. It's a rare S3 grass. So good to have that rare, very rare species there. As well as grasses, we have about a dozen members of the sedge family, Cyperaceae. On the left is Torres sedge, which is an example of one of the 2 main types of sedge, which have a separate male spike or inflorescence and separate female ones. The male one here is flowered and is closing up, lost the stamens, and the single seeds are developing inside these green capsules known as perigyna. So very typical prairie sedge. On the right is hooker sedge, which belongs to the second type of a second group of sedges, in which the male and female flowers are in the same spikelets, so you don't have any differentiation of male and female. And hooker sedge is a very flat, very densely tufted sedge that seems to do well along pathways because it doesn't really tolerate high vegetation. And I was surprised to see that there was, despite the fact that it's rare, there's quite a lot of it in River Lot 56 natural area in St. Albert, growing specifically along the trails. Okay, a few more grassland species. Meadow blazing star, Liatris ligulistylis. Most of us are familiar with that. It also grows in both Nisku and Fort Saskatchewan prairie. It's a composite, of course. Lilac-flowered beard tongue, Penstemon gracilis. There's a small population of that, along, of course, with the more common slender blue beard tongue with somewhat smaller flowers, but very similarly shaped. And on the right, yellow owl clover, Orthocarpus luteus, which is pretty unusual in being an annual and also a semi-parasite, a root parasite. It gets extra nutrition by having its roots clamp onto the roots of other species in this dense prairie turf. But it's only half parasite because, as you can see, it's green and so it can photosynthesize. And here is Manna's picture of harebells set in a lovely hillside with some other species, for example, Artemisia ludoviciana, these gray leaves, a companion plant of Artemisia frigida, which we saw earlier with the narrower leaves, intermediate oak grass. This looks like a chokecherry bush here. This is a badland escarpment, and somewhere lurking down here in this hollow is the Sturgeon River. A couple of more graminoid species, one at Dudley's rush. We have 2 or 3 rush species liking the moisture in the bottomlands closer to the river. And on the drier slopes, once more, sandgrass, Spirobolus rigidus, it used to be called Calamovilfa longifolia, which is a tall, tufted plant with gray-green foliage and these nice sort of whitish panicles, which I like very much. It's also quite profuse on the sandy soils of Fort Saskatchewan prairie, but does not occur in the wetter meadows of Nisku. The prairie has a number of shrubs. You saw those groups of shrubs along the river and in some of the gullies and ravines, such as Saskatoon, chokecherry, western snowberry, the odd gooseberry, raspberry. But so I've just picked out a couple of the 2 more spectacular ones. One is prairie rose, Rosa arkansana, which is a low-growing rose with a nice big white or pale pink flower. Also can be found at Nisku Prairie. And a medium-sized shrub called narrow-leaved meadowsweet, which is also in the rose family. The only difference is that those small flowers are much smaller than the rose, but they have a similar rose construction. And this narrow-leaved meadowsweet forms quite extensive thickets in the moister areas alongside the river and in the lower slopes. And it also occurs in moist areas in Nisku Prairie. And the funny thing is that it only seems to occur on the east side of Edmonton, both in the north and in the south, but always on the east side, not on the west. And this is a general picture of the slopes. By the way, the town of Gibbons is lurking behind these trees here. So it's an east facing slope, and these are patches of the spirea, and sometimes occurring against a backdrop of aspen and some taller shrubs here. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here and look at some of the anthropogenic effects that are prevailing on the prairie. Like all grasslands in settled areas, Gibbons Prairie is subject to a number of threats. I don't think it's going to be built on anytime soon, but I'm afraid some of the locals treat it as their off-highway vehicle playground. This is what we encountered way back in November 2011 when we made some of our first trips to the area, having been alerted to the fact that the prickly pear cactus grew there. These terrible deep ruts made by snowmobiles coming in from Highway 28 at the top of the slope here. And we found when we visited in the summer of 2012, when we made a number of visits to this newfound botanical treasure, that these ruts were persisting. And it looks as though new ruts were being made that year by, in this case, OHVs, gouging out these ruts on the lower, wetter slopes. So we weren't very happy about this. We've felt that there must be some way to stop this destruction of these beautiful grasslands. Judith Golub was very, very involved in this. She was outraged. And one of the first things she did was ascertain by going to the land titles office that these slopes actually belong to the town of Gibbons, because Gibbons was saying, oh, we're not sure we're responsible for it. And she pointed out that they were. We made a couple of delegations to town council meetings, showed them some slides, tried to impress upon them how very important and unusual this stretch of escarpment was. And they did listen to us. They didn't move especially fast, but by 2015, they had erected a 4-strand barbed wire fence along Highway 28 and put up some of these environmentally sensitive areas signs. And there were quite a few naysayers saying, oh, it won't last. People will cut the barbed wire. But in fact, it did seem to work for a few years. The ruts started to heal with no further incursions. First of all, with annual weeds, which are always the initial colonizers of bare ground, but these were rapidly overtaken by the native species. Here's our western wheatgrass, for instance, on the left, there's pale green tufts, and on the right, a grass called saltgrass, which also colonized these ruts. And yeah, things went along okay for 2 or 3 years. And then suddenly in the winter of 2022, 2023, we got the news that the snowmobiles were once again charging up and down the slopes. And in this time, coming in from across the frozen Sturgeon River. This guy here is probably on Crown land. Here's the border fence, the Crown land at the north, but he's most likely come in from a breach in the fence, which we found this past year, where the fence had been completely broken down. The trees associated with it also broken down, so it was easy enough for a vehicle to get through. And once again, the ruts persist through into the summer season. This is what they were looking like by the end of April 2023, coming both from Highway 28, going all the way down the slope, and presumably crossing the river here. This time we have once again protested to the town of Gibbons, but and suggested that they need to redo the breached fencing, put up more signs, and if possible, put some prohibitive signs along the Sturgeon River. But unfortunately, I don't know whether it's because of a new town council or not, but they have refused to give us a hearing. They've ignored our letter, and they declined to allow us to speak to council, which puts us in a real quandary about what to do. There are also other management problems associated, which actually could even turn out to be worse in the long term. There is a lot of the dreaded invasive smooth brome grass, which comes in particularly from the aspen forests lining Highway 28. And where there is some moisture, it can get a foothold. It hasn't so far spread into this area of native grass here, but it may do so. And this is a full population of smooth brome. The trouble is that municipalities don't understand what a threat smooth brome is, and that there is a need to control it, but by appropriate management. So I did a bit of speculating about, given the fact that the town is no longer listening to us, I wondered how we might better protect the area. The obvious steward is Gibbons Town itself, because it is the landowner and it does have some resources. And also there's some evidence that they actually do think that they are somewhat proud of that escarpment. And a good sign is that when they did a new recreational plan for the whole town a couple of years ago, they did not include the escarpment in it. So they recognized that it was sensitive and that it couldn't stand any extensive trail system or any extensive usage within it. But again, I think they think because it's natural, it doesn't need any kind of management. And for some reason, which I don't understand because they're not communicating with us, we don't understand why they haven't really moved to keep those OHVs out, which, you know, even without any knowledge of ecology, should be an obvious management measure. It might be protected if it was designated a natural area owned by the provincial government, but I'm pretty certain this would never happen. The province delegates responsibility to municipalities. It doesn't take responsibility away from it. It could be designated an environmentally significant area. It could qualify under a high definition of an ESA, because it is a very unusual feature in the local area, and it exhibits low to moderate disturbance. But again, Gibbons Town may not wish to have anything to do with this. It may think it's adequately protected. And also it's not clear what sort of management might be required under an ESA. It might be a key biodiversity area, but it probably wouldn't qualify because there are strict international criteria for KBAs. It might be owned by a land trust, such as Edmonton and Area Land Trust or the Nature Conservancy of Canada, who would put a conservation easement on it, which would confer stable protection and some management. But they couldn't afford to buy it, I don't think, unless Gibbons Town donated it. And we have no idea whether they would be willing to do that. There might be other means of securing it, for example, as a conservation area under a provincial land use framework, but the province is not designating any more land use frameworks as part of its regional plans these days. So my suggestion is our best hope for the immediate term is to create a stewards group for example, called Friends of Gibbons Badlands Prairie, which would consist mainly of local people. They could monitor, obtain grants to pay professionals to do some major management work like weed control. They could afford fencing and signage, and they could do some public education and interpretation. They might even put a conservation easement on it. I think one of the best chances for the escarpment is for Gibbons Town to really appreciate what it is with an ecologically literate population, who do understand what a treasure they have, a treasure that they can probably only go into occasionally in guided field trips and which they can look at, but which they certainly can't drive vehicles in. How are we doing? Okay, we've just less than 5 minutes left. If you don't mind, I just want to try and explain why those different types of photosynthesis are adaptive. And I'm going to read this off so as to be as succinct as possible. As I mentioned, C3 is the basic photosynthetic process. It's used by 85% of plants, particularly those, it's definitely adequate, efficient in moist and cool climates. It involves one carbon molecule from carbon dioxide entering in from the atmosphere, of course, joining with a 5-carbon molecule called ribulose biphosphate to yield 2 molecules of 3-phosphoglyceric acid, which will eventually yield that 6-carbon sugar, the end product of photosynthesis. Because of the 3-carbon molecule, it's called C3 photosynthesis. Excuse me. This takes place in the Calvin or C3 reaction cycle in the cell chloroplast, and solar energy is converted to and stored as chemical energy in that photosynthetic process. I should say that you may not be able to follow all this, but there is a lot of information on photosynthesis on the internet. And since this process is the basis of all our animal life, it's probably worth trying to understand it. The people who elucidated, the scientists who elucidated it, got the Nobel Prize for biochemistry from doing so. And indeed, it is a pretty darn complicated process. Anyway, within C3 photosynthesis, the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction is rubisco. And this can accept oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. And in a high oxygen environment, it accepts oxygen and reverses photosynthesis. So instead of forming carbohydrate, sugar, and enclosing or fixing energy, it actually releases carbon dioxide and energy. This process is called photorespiration. It's a bit like the general process of respiration, but it takes place during photosynthesis. And the process is inefficient, of course. It's losing photosynthetic product. And at the same time, the plant has its stomata open and is losing water without making sugar. As I say, in a moist, in an environment with plenty of water, this inefficiency doesn't necessarily matter that much. But in climates with hot, dry environments, there is a better type of photosynthesis, which is more efficient. C4 photosynthesis involves a step before the C3 pathway, and about 3% of plants use it. And they're the plants with the Krantz leaf anatomy that I showed earlier on. In C4 photosynthesis, 1 carbon molecule from carbon dioxide is added onto a 3-carbon molecule, not the 5-carbon molecule, a 3-carbon molecule called PEP, phosphoenol pyruvate, which yields a 4-carbon compound, malic acid, in the chloroplast. And the enzyme catalyzing this reaction is PEP carboxylase, which does not accept O2, oxygen. So in plants with Krantz leaf anatomy, malic acid is formed in the chloroplasts of those mesophyll cells, remember the cells both in the top and bottom layers of the leaf, and move to the bundle sheath cells surrounding the veins. And there it's broken down to carbon dioxide and PEP again, and the carbon molecule then enters the normal C3 pathway in the chloroplast to produce sugar. Always in the C3 cycle, it's the Rubisco enzyme. But in this case, in the bundle sheath cells, they're now so low in oxygen that the Rubisco has no choice but to accept carbon dioxide. And so photorespiration does not occur, making the process of photosynthesis more efficient. Although it does require energy to pump the malic acid back to the bundle sheath cell, to the bundle sheath cells from the mesophyll cells, having entered from the stoma, and the PEP back to mesophyll cells. And that just reminds you again of the leaf anatomy with the mesophyll cells, top and bottom, malic acid being formed inside there, shunted by use of energy into these bundle sheath cells where it enters into the C3 cycle. Meantime, the PEP is shunted back to the mesophyll cells. Now, CAM, or crassulacean acid metabolism, photosynthesis, takes place mainly in succulent plants, such as, for example, members of the Crassulaceae, and in cacti, and in orchids. It has the same C4 reaction before entering the C3 pathway, but the C4 step takes place at night when the stomata are open, and they're only open at night. There are no special bundle sheath cells here. It's a question of timing. At night, carbon from carbon dioxide and PEP forms the same 4-carbon compound again, malic acid. And this moves into the cell vacuoles, the watery liquid inside the cells, and is stored there overnight. As day approaches, the malic acid splits back into CO2 and PEP again, and the CO2 moves into the chloroplast and enters the C3 pathway and goes through the normal Calvin or C3 pathway using the energy of light to form sugars. The Rubisco, same enzyme again in the C3 cycle, is in a low oxygen environment because the stomata are closed. So because the stomata are closed, there's no water loss. So this is highly efficient for plants that need to save water. And interestingly, because the malic acid is stored at night in the cells, if the plants are eaten at night, they will taste bitter due to the presence of the acid. And just summing up those 3 processes, 1-step C3 photosynthesis, carbon dioxide entering the Calvin cycle and forming ultimately the 6-carbon sugar. C4 photosynthesis using Krantz leaf anatomy. C4 is formed in the mesophyll and then is broken down again to carbon dioxide in the bundle sheath where it enters the Calvin cycle and so forms a sugar. And in CAM metabolism or CAM photosynthesis, carbon dioxide joins to form a C4 molecule, malic acid, in the mesophyll cells during the dark. In the light, it's broken down to carbon dioxide again and enters the Calvin cycle and forms a sugar. Notice the Calvin cycle must always take place in the presence of light because that's where the energy comes from to produce the sugar. And as I say, if you can't follow this quick version, then there's plenty of explanation available on the website. But I just find it extremely intriguing that plants have these physiological adaptations, not always obvious to the observer, but nevertheless vitally important, enabling them to thrive in their habitats. And so that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for sticking with it. And if you have any comments or questions, they're either in the chat or you can maybe ask now.